we had such a wonderful year this year. And for once, and this doesn't happen very often, I have, a good news story to tell you. It's the story about 2021. It's the year when we actually had flows return to the Everglades and to Florida Bay, and the incredible ecological responses that ensued because of this. Right, let me just see if we can get going. This will all smooth up in a minute. There we go. All right. So let's see. So before I get into the good stuff, really I need to provide a little bit of historical context. I know that there's some of you in the audience that aren't as familiar. Some of you are very familiar with the Everglades, but there are those that aren't. And so if we look at this image on the right-hand side here, we see this representation of South Florida and the Everglades from a historical context, from about the 1850s. And I've put a couple of reference points on here: West Palm Beach and Miami here, the Keys down here in Florida Bay, to give you a sort of sense of scale. But what's important here is that the Everglades historically really was a river of grass. Seasonal pulses of water literally flowed slowly but surely from Lake Okeechobee through this ancient forest of custard apples, through this massive sawgrass plain, and into the major landscape feature of the Everglades, which is this ridge and slough landscape. And I have a photo of that here on the left. It's an undulating landscape, a corrugated kind of landscape of parallel higher elevation ridges and lower elevation watery sloughs that are, and dotted throughout that would be the tree islands and tropical hammocks. That's the main feature of the Everglades. And water would flow all the way down south over the higher elevation marsh prairies that we have in pink shown here. These are shallower wetlands, very important for foraging birds. Through the major slough arteries here we have in the southern Everglades, into the coastal lakes and bays, through mangrove forests, and then either into Florida Bay in the south or the Gulf Coast in the west. And then we have three major slewways. We have Taylor Slough that channels fresh water into Florida Bay. We have the major Shark River Slough, the biggest of all the sloughs, that channels water mainly into the Gulf, but potentially also is important for supplying fresh water to Florida Bay. And then we have the very aptly named Lost Slough, which has largely been forgotten in terms of restoration, but it was critical for supplying water to these western mile prairies that were the feeding grounds for the massive wading bird colonies that we had here on this west coast that we called the Fertile Crescent. And it was here that we had about 90% of all the wading bird colonies, where literally hundreds of thousands of birds would be nesting. This watery landscape supported an absolute treasure trove of biodiversity. Of course, we have the wading birds that we all know about. But we also had, very healthy populations of large predators, including alligators in the freshwater system, American crocodiles along the coast, and multiple species of sharks in Florida Bay, to name but a few. And we also had very large populations, hundreds of thousands of wintering water birds, including waterfowl, ducks and American coots, shorebirds and seabirds. And yes, we even had flamingos. Recent research has shown that not only did we have thousands of flamingos using Florida Bay throughout the year, but they also bred there. There's good evidence that they bred there as well. So flamingos as well. And of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the biodiversity that we had in the Everglades. And yet, sadly, as we all know, humans made some major changes to this paradise. Half of it has been converted to either agricultural or urban development. And much of what is left has been drained by 100 miles of canals and compartmentalized into a series of ponded impoundments called the water conservation areas. And those water conservation areas includes the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge up here in the north, Water Conservation Area 2A and 3A, and then to the south we have Everglades National Park. But because of all this, much less water now enters the Everglades system. And this is particularly acute in the southern part of the system, in Everglades National Park, where far less water actually flows through these sloughs and enters Florida Bay and hydrates these marl prairies. So these marl prairies are much drier than they were historically, and the coast and the bay, in Florida Bay, is more saline than it was historically. And of course, all this has had quite the effect, serious repercussions on the ecology of the system. Now, if we take wading birds, for instance, which is my focal study species, there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of nesting populations of these birds, particularly those species that are tactile foragers. Those are the species that feed by touch, such as the wood storks, that's declined by about 87%, and the white ibis that's declined by about 78%. We've also seen a shift in the location of those nesting colonies. Like I was saying earlier, these birds historically nested along this present here along the coast. But shortly after drainage in the 1940s and the 50s, these birds moved to the more to the central Everglades and actually elsewhere. And they nest now in much lower numbers than they did so historically. We've also seen a shift in the timing of the nesting for wood storks, which historically nested in November, December, and now nest much later in January, February, and March. And the problem here is that they have such a long nesting period that when they start later, they end up still having chicks in the nest at the time that the rainy season starts again in May and June. And what happens there is the water levels rise and they basically lose their food resources. So often those chicks just starve to death because there's no food. And it was particularly terrible in 2020 when about 95% of all nests failed. So those are some of the things that have happened. And yet, despite all this and many other issues that the Everglades faces, my story today is actually one of hope, of ecological resistance, and the Everglades' incredible powers of recovery. So in the autumn of 2020, and actually I was thinking about this, it was actually this time last year, Tropical Storm Etta passed over the Keys and Florida Bay and the Everglades and released a deluge of almost biblical proportions on the Everglades and rehydrated our overdrained landscape and actually allowed these flows to return to the Southern Everglades and Florida Bay once again. And so the whole point of this story really is to show the ecological responses of these flows and to explain why, even though this was a natural event, the occurrences and the responses of these, why they give me so much hope for Everglades restoration and the future of the Everglades. And so to do all this, I'm going to split the talk into two very different parts. The first is going to be the wading bird responses in 2021. That's my speciality. I'm going to talk about the reasons why they did so well and why their responses give me hope and what that means in terms of Everglades restoration and the science we've learned from this year. And in the second part, I'm going to go through a photographic journey, show you a number of the photos that I took this year during my surveys, particularly my aerial surveys, to try to give you a sort of better visual understanding and actually a unique perspective of the Everglades and what happened in this incredible year. So let's start off with the wading birds. And we're going to talk now about the wading bird nesting patterns. And so what we can see from this figure here is that it's the number of nests of wading birds in the Everglades protection area. So that's the Everglades National Park and the water conservation areas and the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge over the last 32 years. That's 1986 to 2017. And it's for our indicator species. This is not the total number of wading birds in the system. This is just our indicator species: the white ibis, the wood stork, and the great egret and the snow egret. Those are our SERP restoration indicator species. And there's a number of things to note here. The first is there was, the long-term shifts in nesting patterns. We've gone from really low numbers in the 80s and 90s, only about 5,000 nests per year, until about 2000, when we saw this big jump to about 31,000 nests on average per year. And this kind of, we're not entirely sure the reason, but it does correspond to a number of things: a reduction in mercury levels, changes in the laws regarding mercury releases. There was a shift in climate to slightly wetter conditions. And also there's much better communication at this point between water managers and the ecologists studying these birds. So the second thing to note is the variability in nesting among years. So we've got years where we have about 63,000 nests and down to about 8,000 nests. So very variable between years. And that's okay. This is a natural characteristic of wading birds. We don't necessarily want them having a major nesting event every single year. This is what they did historically. They would go from 100,000 one year to almost 0 nests the next year, and that on about a 2 to 3 year scale of having good nesting events. So this is kind of the pattern we're looking for, but obviously we want larger numbers of nests. Then from about 2010, everything went a little bit flat. We had the lows, but we didn't have the highs. Now, this still excites me, this next part, because in 2018, we had one of the largest nesting events since the 1940s, basically. And these data are out there. It's in my wading bird report. It's in National Audubon magazine. It was in all the newspapers. So many of you may have already seen this, but it still kind of surprises me when I do this next thing to show just how many nests there were. For these 4 species, 116,000 nests. That's almost 4 times more than the recent average, 20 times greater than it was in the 1980s, and essentially the largest nesting event we've had since the 1940s. Then the next couple of years went flat again. That's to be expected. We had drier conditions than we did in 2018. And then this year, and I forgot to tell you guys, this data that I'm going to show you now and some of the other data is hot off the press. You guys are the first people to actually see these data. So apart from a few scientists and colleagues of mine, none of the public has actually seen this yet. So this year in 2021, we had an excellent nesting year. And because of Hurricane Eta and the very wet conditions, and we had another incredible nesting season, almost 94,000 nests. Now, that isn't quite the event we had in 2018, at least in terms of numbers of nests. But the fact that we've not only had one once in a lifetime major nesting events recently, we've actually had 2 in the last 4 years. And I think that is even more important and impressive than the 2018 nesting event in itself. Okay, and in terms of the refuge had about 13,500 nests, which may seem a relatively small amount compared to the 93,000. But what we have to remember is the refuge is a relatively small area compared to the rest of the Everglades. So the refuge actually had a very good nesting season with that 13,000 nests. Okay, so I just added this slide at the last minute, but basically it's showing the response of each of the individual 4 species. And so if we look here, this is, we look at the end here, this is the 2021 nesting figure, and we can see that this is for the white ibis, this is for the great egret, and these dotted lines here are the averages. So each species, the woodstock here and even the snow egret, produce more nests than they do on average. Some of them a lot more than average, particularly the white ibis. Now, we may think of the white ibis as just kind of a trashy bird that we see in our lawns eating cockroaches, but it's fundamental to the health of the Everglades system, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But it was white ibis that really seemed to have really responded to these 2 very wet years with much larger jumps in nesting compared to other good years such as 2009. The great egret, for instance, the response wasn't as high as 2018 or as 2009. So it's really the white ibis that is showing a major increase this year. And also that I'd like to just point out the snow egrets and other small herons, they've really declined dramatically in recent years and haven't been doing well. So to see these guys actually get up above their long-term average was very encouraging. Okay, so that wasn't the end of the good news though, because not only did we have huge numbers of nests in 21, the nesting was also extremely successful in terms of fledging success. Now, I don't have the data. We're still working up the actual data to show, the proportion of birds that actually fledged. But just from my surveys, just taking these photos and seeing the birds, we were seeing 2 to 3 or even 4 large healthy chicks fledge from most of the nests. And so really good fledging success for most species, for all the species actually. And it's not just the fledging success that's important here though, because these birds fledged into really good foraging conditions. So the major limitation for an individual bird, its survival rate in the first year is very low. If it can get through that first year, then it has a really good chance of surviving. But that first year is crucial because these birds are naive. They don't really know how to forage effectively. They're naive to predators and all these things. So, so what's really important, what really affects their survival are the conditions that these birds fledge into. And the conditions the birds fledged into in 2021 were just perfect. There were literally tens of thousands of these young birds joining the major foraging flocks, learning to forage, getting the fat reserves that they need to be able to support them, when things get a bit leaner. And that will be, it probably was the largest recruitment event that we've had since the 1940s. And ultimately, that's what key. It's not about the number of nests we produce. Ultimately, it's about how many fledglings that we produce that can go on to breed and join the overall population. And I think in terms of that, 2021 has been our most successful year of all since the 1940s. So probably the most interesting thing, though, from a scientific point of view, is that the colonies returned to the coast. We had about just shy of 30,000 birds nesting again in these coastal colonies. We have to remember that 10, 15 years ago, there were no birds nesting in this region. So now that represents about 23% of all nests in the Everglades. And our restoration target for getting these birds nesting back down in these coastal colonies again is greater than 50%. So we didn't even come close to that. But the point here is it's the magnitude of the nesting event that's important. the fact that these coastal regions can still attract and support these large numbers of nests means that we can continue to do this in the future if we get the water right again. And so, so what does all that mean? Well, so we had this very successful year. It was driven largely by, fluke conditions. But what it means is that these birds and the Everglades itself is highly resilient. It means we can recover these birds extremely quickly. And we didn't know that until 2018 and 2021 this year. So, we've been doing science. There's been a lot of science being done on these birds for the last 20, 30 years. And, we've learned an incredible amount, but we did not know what it would actually take to be able to restore these birds. And what this has shown is that these birds can come back, almost immediately after we provide those good habitat, not just habitat conditions, but when we provide the right amount of water and the right conditions for them to forage in. Also, what's really key about this is that we now know restoration will work. And we can go to policymakers and water managers with these data and say, hey, look, if you do this, this is the response you're going to get from these birds. Beforehand, we weren't able to say that. We had science. We could predict what would happen with Everglades restoration, but now it's far more predictable and certain that if we are able to provide these hydrologic conditions, these birds will return. And that's critically important. So, okay, so let's now get into what it was that made 2018 and largely 2021, very similar conditions, what it was that made it such a good year. And so the major factor that limits these birds is their availability of their food. So that's the aquatic prey, the fishes, the crayfishes, and other aquatic invertebrates. And this availability is strongly determined by hydrologic conditions. And so by hydrologic conditions, I mean things like water depths, how long hydro periods, that's how long water lasts for in the marsh, how quickly water levels rise and fall, all these kind of different aspects of the water within the Everglades. And this prey availability can be basically broken down into two components. The first part and the first stage is that we need to be able to produce a lot of prey for these birds. And this is really quite simple. These aquatic animals that these birds are feeding on need water. Fish need water, right? So in a fluctuating wetland such as the Everglades, where water levels rise in the summer and then fall and sometimes dry out in the winter, the longer we have water, the greater the production of prey. And that's shown here in this figure here. We're showing the density of these blue-finned killifish increases as the days, the longer the days, the wetland stays wet. So it's very simple. There are some major complications to this. Certain species like crayfish require a period of drought that affects predation, but for the sake of time in this presentation, we won't get into it. Okay, so the next part is we've produced all that prey. The second stage is we need to make that prey accessible for the birds to be able to capture. So this figure, the top row here, basically shows the landscape throughout the dry season, the ridge and slough landscape as it's drying down. And below here, we have the wading bird response to those drying conditions. And so what happens essentially is that during the wet season here at the beginning, the ridge and slough landscape is almost completely flooded. Not just the sloughs, but the ridges and the tree islands, and the prey are dispersed all among those different habitats. As the dry season kicks in and water levels start to decline, the fish and crayfish move from these ridges and tree islands into the sloughs, And as water levels continue to decline, the area of the aerial coverage of water in the landscape shrinks. And what that shrinkage does is it's concentrating those prey. Those prey are now in smaller and smaller area and shallower water. And that increases the density of those prey to a degree that the birds can actually forage on them effectively. And that's particularly important for these tactile touch feeding species like the wood stork and the white ibis, the feed and the spoonbill, that feed by touch and need very high densities of prey to be able to forage effectively. And then as the season continues, things continue to dry down. And then back in May, when the summer returns, the landscape fills up again with water and we lose those patches of prey. And remember, I was talking about the wood storks earlier. They're still nesting sometimes when this is happening. And so that's why they're failing, they're losing that prey base. And what we don't want to happen during the year is a major rain event, say in March, when the birds are all fully breeding, starting their nesting, we have a rain event and we basically lose everything. That happens quite frequently as well. Now, you may be thinking now that, okay, that's okay for one particular place in the landscape, but these things are ephemeral. These foraging patches do not last very long at all, maybe a couple of weeks. So what we need is for these foraging patches to move through the landscape. You know, the Everglades is on a slope, it has different elevations. So as the landscape dries, different areas are coming in, you know, becoming available for foraging for these birds. And so those are kind of the ideal conditions for the birds during the breeding season. So let's look at what the conditions were like for the birds in 2021. And we'll start off with the prey production. So for prey production, remember that's the conditions before the nesting season, during the wet season beforehand. And a good way to sort of highlight how good 2021 was is to compare it to an average year. So what I have here are two maps, two water depth maps of the Everglades. So here we have the refuge here at the top, you know, all the way down to Florida Bay at the bottom. And we have, here is the water depth map for the conditions leading into 2020 nesting season, which was a moderately dry season and produced average number of nests, about 37,000 nests. And here on the right, we have the conditions in the peak of the wet season in 2020, leading into the 2021 nesting season, where we had much larger, 97,000 nests in total. And what we see here is the color-coded water depths. And the main point to note here, and excuse this, it's in centimeters, that's just how our scientists work with. Basically, this dark blue here is about 1.5 feet deep. 30 centimeters here is a foot deep. And so anything below about a foot deep at the peak of the wet season is just far too dry to produce fish. It's just too shallow and dries out too quickly. And the water just doesn't last long enough to be able to produce much. So what we can see in this landscape leading up to 2020 is it was pretty dry. The marl prairies that are so important for the coastal colonies are pretty dry, and the big cypress just are not producing much in the way of prey. Another key area is northern 3A, water conservation area 3A here. This has, where I've put the laser pointer right now, is one of the largest colonies probably in the United States. It's called Alley North Colony and can support almost up to 70,000 nests in a good year. And so this area is a critical foraging habitat. And of course, for the size, the refuge is also a very critical and important foraging habitat as well. And in all these regions, we're seeing very little in the way of good conditions to produce prey. On the other hand, if we look at the conditions leading into 2021, the whole landscape is flooded. So not only are we producing good prey in a specific location, we're producing more prey across the entire landscape. Okay, so in answer to that question, yes, conditions were very good for producing prey for 2021. Now, let's talk about prey accessibility during the nesting season. Now, I want you to look at these depth maps in a slightly different way now. You may have been wondering why on earth I'd have green in the middle of this. Well, that's because these maps are actually called habitat suitability maps. These color-coded water depths here, these categories actually respond to how good they are for wading bird foraging, with the green areas being the optimal foraging depth for these birds. The blue areas, particularly the dark blue areas, being too deep, and the dark browner areas being too dry, okay? So I want you to think of this in terms of these green areas. You want to be looking for green areas. And what we want to see is green areas starting to appear early in the dry season, so about January. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to move through a couple of months through the dry season. And what we want to see is these green areas moving south, moving into the sloughs, but still having those green areas all the way through the nesting season. So we're seeing this progression of green move through the landscape. And critically, we want to see these green areas starting early and staying in these key foraging habitats, the marl prairies, Northern 3A, and the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. And these red areas, by the way, so this is where these green areas are predictions of where we see the birds in terms of depths. The red areas are where I actually saw them when I was doing my flights. And you're also going to see stars pop up. They're some of the major nesting colonies. Okay, so December, the whole landscape is very wet still. No foraging occurring. There are some green areas in the rocky glades here, but that's not a very good area for foraging. What I was really surprised about though, was I went down to the southern part of the Everglades, and for the first time, we saw about 40 to 50,000 wading birds foraging along these coastal margins. The flows that were coming in through Taylor Slough and Shark River Slough had created this much less saline, much fresher conditions, and prey productivity was going through the roof, and the birds were responding incredibly. And now this is important because at this point, the birds aren't nesting, but they're getting into nesting condition and having good, this is the area where the birds first come from all over the southeast of the United States. They come down to South Florida first, check it out. If the conditions are good, they stay. If they're not, they go off, and we lose them to be able to breed. So having good conditions early in the season is good to get these birds staying here. Okay, so now we're into January, and we can start to see that the landscape is starting to dry out. There's still birds foraging, about 10,000 birds foraging along the coast, but we're starting to see green areas in the western marl prairies and southern big cypress. This was attracting about 4,000 white ibis. Northern 3A was supporting about 15,000 birds at this time, and Northern 2A was also supporting large numbers of birds. And at this point in January, we're also starting to see some of the colonies starting to form along the coast, along the woodstock colonies in 3 and 3A. So prey are starting to become available. As we go into March, things are really hotting up. The landscape is drying. There's still plenty of scope for the landscape to dry down. Here in the marl prairies, at this time, I had never seen wading birds foraging like it. There were so many white ibis, between 20 and 30,000 white ibis foraging in these marl prairies. It literally, as we flew over, we'd see a flock of 3,000 ibis, 5,000 ibis, 10,000 ibis. It was just ibis everywhere. It was and other species as well. It was absolutely incredible. The same thing was kind of going on here, maybe to a lesser extent, but there were less birds foraging, but the colonies here were enormous. Here we had about 30,000 birds, white ibis nesting, and about 40,000 nests in total in that colony. And we're also at this point starting to see some really large flocks starting in the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. Now, this is a bit later, but that's okay. We still have plenty of scope for the rest of the season. And then in May, which is almost towards the end, the nesting season actually, the dry season actually lasted into June. But now we can see down here in the south, the birds are the marl prairies have now dried. That's to be expected. The birds are moving down into the sloughs, Lossman Slough and southern part of Shark River Slough. 3A was actually too wet this year, but the birds are finally starting to move into 3A, still foraging in northern 3A, and we're seeing huge numbers of birds. And a major colony starting, about 8,000 birds nesting in, well, just one colony, sorry, I should say, of about 8,000 birds, a large colony in the refuge. So conditions were absolutely perfect, not only for supporting, these nesting birds, but also supporting those fledglings, in May and June after they left the nest. Okay, so how are we doing for time? What time do we need to finish?
Mark, we were shooting for 7, but people can drop off if they need to.
Okay.
We'll record the whole thing.
Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize this and then we'll get into the photo. So essentially, both in 2018 and 2021, we had this perfect storm of sequential hydrologic conditions that led to optimal prey production and accessibility. 2021 was the second largest nesting event since the 1940s, but as I was stating, it was probably the largest recruitment again, which is overall more important. We probably produced more young birds to enter these populations of wading birds since the 1940s. So a huge boost to the populations. And remember, these are long-lived birds. They live 14, 15 years. So we're going to have these large populations for a long time to come here. What we learned, though, is there were some important lessons we learned. The location and timing of optimal foraging habitat is critical for these large nesting events, particularly along the coast. So it's really critical to have the right conditions in the marl prairies and in northern 3A early in the season if we want to be able to have these large nesting events. And then finally, these 2 years really highlight the resiliency of the Everglades and its wading birds. And it demonstrates just how quickly we can recover these birds if we get the water right. And if we can do Everglades restoration and get water flowing through the system again. And, there's no excuse anymore. We know we can do it, at least in terms of wading birds and, the trophic structure that supports these wading birds. Okay, so I'm going to try to run through these as quick as I can. This is the second part. This is more about the photography and the images I took during my surveys. And we're going to, and it'll start off in November and go through to May and June. And we're starting off mainly in the Florida Bay and the coastal region, because that's where everything started this year. I talked about the wading birds, but it wasn't just the wading birds that did well this year. So many other critters benefited. So, this is a picture of Tropical Storm Eta. It was it was maybe a few days before it happened. Clouds were building up when we were, fixing up our field station in preparation for the storm. But what that storm did is it produced this pulses of flows into the bay and into the coastal region. And by doing that, it created this ideal conditions for seagrass to grow, for invertebrates and fish to grow. Fishermen had are reporting some of the best fishing that they've had in decades because of because of these flows. And so what I'm going to do in these images is to show you just some of the critters that I think did really well, and I think some of these photos will speak for themselves. So we're going to start off. This is my wife thinks this looks like the vein on an eyeball, or the veins on a bodily organ. But what it actually is it's this flow patterns going into Garfield Bight in Florida Bay. There was so much water flowing into the system that for the first time ever, I saw these actually dendritic flow patterns. And to give you a sense of scale, this little critter down here at the bottom, that's a 9-foot alligator. And another thing I hadn't seen maybe once in my 18 years is an alligator in the middle of Florida Bay like this. These are freshwater species. They do not like the marine environment very much, but there's so much fresh water flowing in, and that's producing a lot of fish in this region that these alligators are actually moving into Florida Bay, which is the home of the American crocodile. And this actual alligator. I just wanted to show that he's a big old boy. He's really well fed. Sometimes these alligators can be really skinny. This year they seem to be all well fed. His neck is really thick. So just confirming that was a big boy alligator. And it wasn't just the alligators. When you have these flows coming in and fresh water, it's creating excellent conditions for all the sort of tiny microinvertebrates that are living in the sediments. And so you get large numbers of shorebirds. These are American Avocet. You can't really tell from this scale. But I put this image in because I was actually quite proud of it, because it recently won a highly commended award, an international photography award, the Mangrove Photography Awards. Now, this looks like, pollution flowing into the bay, or, some effluent from a sewerage farm. It's really dark. Look at the difference here between the clear waters of the bay and these dark colored water entering. But this is actually very healthy. This is actually the tannins from the decaying mangrove leaves. The water is passing through the mangrove swamps, and when it flows through, it's picking up all the tannins. So basically, this is like this big pot of tea being poured into Florida Bay. And actually, it's critical because many of the fish species, the sports fish, such as tarpon, snook, the youngsters, the young fry, follow the scent of this tannins up to their feeding areas up in the mangrove regions. Now, the whole reason I was in Florida Bay at the time, obviously wasn't to take nice photos of these dendritic patterns of flow, but was to monitor and find the wading birds. And so this is an aerial shot of snake bite in Florida Bay near Flamingo. And I was really surprised to see, occasionally you'll see the odd bird on the beach, but huge numbers just foraging along the beach. And again, here's these tannic flows flowing into the clear waters of the bay in the distance. But it wasn't, the beach wasn't where it was really happening. This was really happening in the mangrove region, just tens of thousands of these foraging birds, wading birds and pelicans and many other species as well. Here, this looks pretty all dead, and it is. This was the mangroves were destroyed by Hurricane Irma in this particular location. But because of the dead, it provided a more open habitat and easier photo for me to show just the densities of these birds rather than in the healthy mangroves. Now, this one you might have to squint at a little bit. This surprise, I put it in not because it's a great photo, but you can see the tiny little white dots. There's actually hundreds of wading birds foraging in the center of the bay. It blew my mind. I've never seen that before. You might see the occasional great white heron or reddish egret in the bay, you know, that's where they typically forage. But here we have snowy egrets and great egrets, hundreds of them, right in the middle of the bay. Okay, so it was, like I was saying, it wasn't just the wading birds. All this fish production created great foraging habitat for many other species. And so here we have part of a large flock of hundreds of American white pelicans. Now, these pelicans are enormous. They've got a 9-foot wingspan and, you know, and a huge appetite to boot. So, you know, to be able to support large numbers of these birds requires a very productive system. And I had never seen so many white pelicans in my life down in this region. And by the way, did I say hundreds of white pelicans? What I meant to say was literally thousands. This is just one of the large flocks of white pelicans that were roosting and feeding along Florida Bay. Here is another flock in flight. I estimated in total, there were about 13,000 white pelicans, which, you know, is about 13% of the entire American population, the entire population of this species. So, you know, a huge proportion of this species was foraging in Florida Bay this year. You know, and it's just an incredible wildlife spectacular right on our doorsteps. This is what happens when we get the water right. This one, you know, sorry, more pelicans, but I just love this image just because we've got this beautiful, weird tanning colored water. And then we had this strange blue-green, greenish algae, not one of the harmful algae, just the green algae. It lasted just a week or two. It created this, you know, this wonderful image in contrasting color with these white pelicans. Right, so it wasn't just white pelicans. This was an enormous flock of black skimmers flying over some of the mudflats. Again, never seen anything like this before, these numbers. And here is another image of that flock. It was a really gray, dark, gloomy day, but just at the right time as these birds were wheeling around, a shaft of sunlight came through, just highlighting these birds. So this is one of my favorite images of these black skimmers. I call this 100,000 shorebirds, not because there's 100,000 in this particular image, but each one of these little dots is a small sandpiper. And, you know, this maybe shows I don't know, what, 1/5 of a mile or something of this mudflat. And it went on like this for miles. So just incredible numbers of these birds. More shorebirds. This time, one of my favorite shorebirds, the American Avocet. I call this one the unconformist, and the reason why, the nonconformist, sorry. And the reason why is this little guy in the middle, hundreds of birds all facing one way. This little guy just decides to face the other way. More American Avocets, this time creating these sort of ephemeral artwork, pretty patterns in these canic waters that are coming out of the sloughs. More art, abstract art, this time by marble gobwits and willets, again in Florida Bay. And it wasn't just shorebirds. We had couple of thousand waterfowl as well, including American coots, redheads, scorp, and we've even got a couple of little ruddy ducks here at the front here. Not as many as I was hoping to see this year, but certainly some indicative of good foraging conditions for these guys. Okay, so with all these small birds and fish, it attracted an awful lot of predators, and the bald eagles in particular did really well. I saw so many bald eagle nests this year. This is a bald eagle nest, kind of a unique view from right above in a dead mangrove right on the edge of Florida Bay. And I'm not sure you can see, but there's some little black things that basically they were feasting on the coots and these waterfowl that were present in such large numbers. But actually, my favorite bald eagle nest is one in the refuge. And here's that nest in the refuge, both in January with the adult brooding the youngsters, I should say, and then later in the year, these two healthy fledgling nestlings just prior to when they fledged. And the reason why it's one of my favorite is because it's consistently very successful. I've been following this for about 7 years now, and every year this nest produces 2 successful fledglings. Now, I used to, this nest was in a tree that I used to call the tree of life, from the Avatar movie, that huge tree that stood above all the others in the jungle. Well, this nest originally was in this huge pine tree, very healthy, enormous pine tree that stood up above the rest of the refuge's landscape. And then all of a sudden it died in 2019. And so this is kind of what's left in 2021. But I want to show, this is my favorite picture of this nest. This was taken actually in 2020. You can see why I call it the tree of life, how it stands up above the landscape and how you could see it from miles around. But what I wanted to do is capture this as this tree decays. I also took a photo of it during foggy conditions this year. This is what it looked like in the spring of this year in the fog. You can see that it's slowly decaying. And I'm hoping that I can take another one that will still be there this year. And the nest will be active and still standing. Now, I'm not worried about the birds. The birds will easily move off and produce another nest. There's plenty of nesting areas for these birds to nest in. So I'm not worried about the birds. The only slight worry I might have is if that nest actually falls down this year while it has nestlings in it. So, bald eagles weren't the only predators. This was very interesting. I was seeing dolphins way up into Shark River Slough in the fresh water. The production of large fish in that region was off the charts this year. So large numbers of dolphins were swimming right up the rivers, up Shark River Slough, and taking advantage of that. This is, the American crocodile. It's our flagship species because it represents the ecological importance of freshwater flows to the bay, which are expected, the freshwater flows are expected to increase, with restoration. And the key here is that although these crocodiles can tolerate marine conditions, they do far better in brackish water where you have about 50% seawater and 50% fresh water. That's optimal for their growth, for their nesting and for the survival of the youngsters. So I know you have Laura Brandt coming to give you a presentation. So I'm hoping that the crocodiles did much better this year, this endangered species, because of these flow conditions. So hopefully Laura will be able to give you more information on that. This is an aerial image of white ibis flying over the mild prairies. I won't go into detail other than, it was just so wonderful to see these birds foraging in this region. This is where we need these birds foraging for these super colonies along the coast. This is a little different. This is the same kind of view of white ibis and other species flying over here. It's northern 3A, and it's dark here because it's got a stormy sky reflecting, but also because this was a recently burned area, and fire is actually critical to the functioning of the Everglades, particularly in some of these thick areas of sawgrass. By having a fire, it opens that up and allows these birds to be able to forage much better and get access to the crayfish and fish and other critters that they're feeding upon. By January, we were starting to see these birds pairing up. Here we have wood storks. I love taking photographs of woodstocks at that first nesting period. They are so loving and gentle to one another, and just such characters. This guy looks like, you know, it's the male above and the female below, and this just reminds me of this guy, you know, telling a bad joke, and the female sort of just being nonplussed about it. But they have so many wonderful communications, and you know, they're always preening one another and snuggling up to one another. It's just, you know, really beautiful to see these birds at this stage. But they are not always particularly that nice to their neighbors. And, you know, they very much have a territory around their nest. Here we have a scene, we call it kleptoparasitism. That's basically theft in the animal world. And here we have this poor adult male brings a nice stick back to the nest. And the neighbors both the male and the female are trying to steal it off him. So interesting things going on in Cabbage Bay in Everglades National Park. No title needed for this one. As you can see, these woodstocks are creating new baby woodstocks. But what I really wanted to show here is just, you know, we think of these, well, some people think of these birds as kind of ugly, but I mean, look at the colors, the iridescence in the wings during the breeding season of these birds. And one thing that happens only during the breeding season is this peach colored feathers in the underwings. So, you know, really quite stunning, spectacular, beautiful birds. Quite simply, just a male egret bringing a stick back to the nest in its full, you know, full of its beautiful plumage and egrets. This is probably one of the most interesting photos that I took. It's spoonbills. I was trying to get them foraging before the sunset, but the birds weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there preening, doing nothing. And then this photo was actually taken about an hour after sunset. These birds were not foraging during the day. They didn't start foraging until it got dark, meaning that they're actually crepuscular foragers. And I'm not sure that anyone has actually recorded that before. These birds were, you know, and this is weird because, you know, I have quite a good camera that can take a photo in low light conditions, but this was almost pitch dark at this point. I could not see these birds. So these birds are somehow using the vestiges of light at the end of the day and being able to see and be able to communicate with one another in these foraging flocks. So that was a really interesting observation. Here we have the refuge in February. We're really starting to see these large foraging flocks. And key to note here is we're not seeing those. Remember I showed you that image, that diagram that showed the birds foraging in these smaller and smaller patches? Well, this whole landscape is flooded here. These birds are foraging in much deeper conditions than we typically think of them foraging in. And the reason is we had so much prey productivity, we didn't need that concentration event so much. There was so much prey that these birds were able to forage. And here's just another photo of that. How are we doing for time? I can keep on going if people want to keep going. So I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I would say, Mark, go right ahead. We're recording this.
Okay.
If anybody needs to drop off, go right ahead, and we'll hopefully post this for everybody to see.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so another example of just these massive flocks of mixed foraging flocks of all species. We've got Ibis, we've got woodstock, spoonbills, huge numbers. I didn't mention the spoonbills so much, but we had almost record-breaking numbers of spoonbills, not in Florida Bay where they're supposed to be, but in the freshwater Everglades. We had almost 900 nests this year, whereas in Florida Bay, we only had just over 200 nests. But the refuge was providing wonderful habitat. The refuge itself is these small herons, what we call the Egretta herons. I mentioned it earlier, they declined quite dramatically, but we are seeing a resurgence, particularly in the refuge, in some of the colonies, in the canals surrounding the refuge. And one of the biggest ones actually is right by the refuge headquarters. So right by the boat ramp. And this year, in about April and May, I caught it right at the right time. I was doing some studies on amphibians in the Lila facility, and there were just huge numbers of fledglings, of snow egrets, of tricolored herons and little blues, all flying onto the levee just by the boat ramp. So it was a marvelous sight to see. So here is a snow egret showing its sort of active foraging behavior. This was taken at Lila at the headquarters, the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, where I do a lot of research. This was actually taken in Pine Glades. That's why we get, because I like to highlight all these colors of this utricularia that's growing with the birds, of a little blue heron. But again, these birds did really well in the refuge this year. And another species, the tricolored heron, again, that's another species that's declined dramatically and is picking up in the refuge. Now, the white ibis, we often think these as kind of grubby, off-white, very common species that feeds in our yards. But just literally for a couple of weeks, they get their plumage changes. They get this brilliant white plumage, and then they get this crimson-colored beak and face, and crimson-colored legs as well. And they look absolutely stunning. But you only really see this when in the Everglades when they're nesting. This was actually taken at the refuge, and this one's a female. You can tell it's a female because it's got a relatively short bill, and they develop this gular patch here, this little flap of skin. So anyway, so that's the white ibis, and I wanted that to lead into the nesting of the white ibis in the refuge. This is an aerial image of an 8,000 nest colony of white ibis. I did have a really good video to show you of this colony, but for some reason it wouldn't download from my iPhone onto my computer. But anyway, so the refuge it's one of those beautiful parts of the Everglades, largely because of all the beautiful tree islands, so many tree islands. And so these birds nest on multiple tree islands. So this particular colony, they were nesting on about, I think it was 32 different islands. And one thing I wanted to point out is, when we have these large nesting events, it isn't just good for the birds, it's good for the rest of the Everglades, for the functioning of the Everglades. So wading birds themselves they nest in these areas that are pretty wet, and so they don't get raccoons and other predators coming in. And the reason for that is that these wet areas are guarded by alligators, and these alligators are ecosystem engineers. They're responsible for digging holes, creating habitat throughout the Everglades that during the dry season all the fish and other animals can take advantage of. These alligators are a keystone species. But I think the white ibis are a keystone species as well, because their chicks, the chicks that fall out the nest, the chicks that die in these massive colonies, provide most of the energy for these alligators. Without these wading birds, these alligators would not have as much. There wouldn't be as many alligators. They wouldn't be as healthy, and they wouldn't be producing as many nests. So, these ibis provide an essential function in terms of supporting these alligators. Another thing you can see here is this big green patch. Now that's caused because, imagine 8,000 ibis nests, that's two adults and 2 to 3 nestlings, which are depositing a huge amount of guano fertilizer. The Everglades is what we call a ligotrophic, starting with an O. It is very nutrient limited. So what these birds are doing is they're concentrating all these nutrients, which is why you're seeing this amazing green patch, all this verdant growth here. Now that is helping these tree islands grow. but it's particularly important in the southern Everglades, particularly with climate change and sea level rise. These these super colonies can actually create these mangrove areas to actually rise and increase and build up land at a rate equivalent to sea level rise that potentially might actually benefit people and limit sea level rise coming into the Everglades and preventing, areas like Miami from getting inundated. So, these birds, as all wildlife do, play critical roles. It's not just about, the fact that we like these charismatic species. And here we have a closer image of that colony from a slightly different angle, taken, in the early morning sunlight. You can see each of these little white dots, that's a nest. What you're not seeing is all the nests underneath as well. Just huge numbers of nests. Closer image still of these white ibis, and a closer image still. A lot of people haven't seen what a young white ibis looks like. They're actually black. This guy is just hatched, maybe a few hours ago. He's dried out, but his eyes are still closed. And we can see another one of the other eggs is just pipping. There's a hole here where the next ibis is about to hatch out. This is what we typically think of good foraging habitat for these birds. When the system dries out, it gets the aerial coverage shrinks. You get very high concentrations, and this does happen. This happened this year, right at the end of the nesting season, when everything dried out. But it wasn't necessarily, as I showed you with those earlier images of the large numbers of birds foraging in these expansive flooded habitats. So we don't need to dry out the system as much if, we can produce enough prey. And just, I just like these images though, just all the patterns of the animal trails leading to these little watering holes. One little bad news part of this year, this was taken on that boat ramp colony, and you'll see this beautiful great egret with his head into the wind with his plumes all blowing out the back here. But sitting right underneath him is something we don't really want to see in a colony in the Everglades, and that's a non-native iguana. And, looking over my photos, I checked out plenty more, and there were fairly large numbers of iguanas in that boat ramp colony. Now I'm still hoping that that's not going to be a problem for the rest of the Everglades. That's really close to the canal. So, not too difficult for these iguanas to swim across, and hoping that they're not going to spread. I don't think they will. I think alligators will prevent them from doing so. But, these are egg eaters, and it could be problematic. Just an image of, now we're into May, we're starting to see these birds just before fledging of these woodstock nests. You can see how well they're doing. Each nest has 2 or 3, healthy looking nestlings. Again, here a closer image of that. Here, these birds are doing their begging. There's an adult off to the right, on the right hand side. They're doing their begging behavior here to try to get some more food. A tricolored heron fledgling at the refuge. That was at that boat ramp colony. I don't think those iguanas had much of an effect, given just how many fledglings there were coming out of that colony. So I'm hoping they didn't have too much of an effect. Now this is a young woodstock. It's pre-fledgling. You can tell it's a young woodstock. We have an adult behind us that shows the dark bill and the bare head, but here we have the yellow bill and the feathered head. And this guy, really couldn't fly. It was a very windy day, but it was using that to its advantage to get some exercise of its wing muscles, just jumping up into the air, getting a feel for its wings. Another kind of interesting thing you can note is that its legs are white. That's a really dilute uric acid, basically bird pee, that they deposit on their legs as a cooling device as they're sitting in the heat of the Florida sun. One of the reasons I know that these birds would fledge so well, that before these birds leave the colony for good, they fledge the nest, they're starting to learn to fly, and they hang out in these creches. And most of these are young spoonbills. This is in Broad River colony down by the coast, and they're being chaperoned by these American white pelicans, and there's a few young woodstorks in here and a few small herons as well. But this is largely a group of very young birds, and what they do is they fly down from their nest, learn to forage, learn to fly, and then when their parents come back to bring them food, then they fly back up to the nest again. But just huge numbers of these birds in these creches. A raccoon. Why am I showing a picture of a trash panda? Well, this was on Cape Sable in Everglades National Park. And we've all heard about how the pythons have destroyed the mammal populations. This is the first raccoon I've seen in the last 10 years. So I'm showing that just because it was just so wonderful to see a raccoon again. Maybe they're adapting. This is probably one of the most exciting things I saw this year. This is two nurse sharks mating. Now, kind of difficult for a shark to nurse, a shark to mate. It doesn't have hands, they're buoyant. So the male is grabbing the female's pectoral fin and dragging it into the shallow water so it can mate. Seems a bit brutal, but it's the way they mate, basically. It's the only way that they can physically do it. This is a really rare occurrence. This, not many people get to see this. And Florida Bay is a really important nursery for, and mating area for these. So having the right conditions is critical for these sharks. And then finally, one of the last things on, I think it was the second to last flight of the year, we came across this lonesome flamingo on Cape Sable. Myself and a group of other scientists, largely organized by the folks at Miami Zoo, are trying to restore habitat in Florida Bay for the return of these flamingos. So it was, great to see this flamingo return, hopefully with improved conditions and maybe a release program. We'll see the return of these birds at some stage in the future. And with that, I'm sorry for going over. I had so many more photos. I gutted my presentation so it would be somewhat in time, but I had many more. So questions.
Mark, thank you so much. I think I can speak for everybody and say absolutely amazing images, remarkable story, extraordinary, and to have your scientific background to match is just a tremendous experience for all of us. A few questions, and if anybody has a few more, we'll try to answer them. The first was, environmentalists are concerned about the massive amount of water that will be flowing through the Everglades with the changes coming, that the tree islands and bird nesting may be harmed and the tree islands flooded.
Yeah, so a slide I wanted to put in, and I'm sorry, I was so limited for time. So yes, there were some negative impacts of the high water, particularly in that central part of the Everglades, 3A. The tree islands, we were a little worried about the tree islands. It wasn't so much the tree islands we were worried about, that they'd been through a couple of dry years. So it's okay to flood. We don't want to be flooding them continuously. They were flooded for longer, but they were actually quite resilient. Our tree island experts were not worried. They've been through this before. What's key is that we had a dry conditions afterwards. There was no real harm to the tree islands themselves, so they did fine. But we do have an issue, unfortunately, with the drying of the landscape, with fires, with over flooding in some areas, these tree islands have actually shrunk. So they're not actually as elevated as they used to be. So trying to provide the water we need for other critters and other components of the ecology of the system ends up, flooding these tree islands. So as we move forward with restoration, we're going to have to be careful. We don't want to overflood it too much. We want to, but by adding more water, we should be able to improve the conditions on these tree islands if we do it slowly. And that will enable those soils to build up, and hopefully those tree islands were okay. Now, unfortunately, the tree islands did okay. What did suffer, unfortunately, was some of the mammal species that were on these tree islands, the raccoons, the deer, bobcats, many, there was, horrible images of these poor animals being soaked and, deaths of these animals. The unfortunate thing is that because we have dried the Everglades, these animals are far more prevalent than they were historically. Historically, you would not have raccoons on tree islands. The ridge and slough system is deep water surrounded by alligators, and raccoons and alligators do not mix. And the only time you get raccoons on these tree islands is when water levels drop and they can literally walk out, and very shallow conditions. That's why wading birds nest in the Everglades in these deeper areas. As soon as you get raccoons in these good areas on these tree islands, these wading birds will abandon completely. They do not like raccoons. The adults will just abandon all their nests. I've seen 20,000 nests abandoned just because we get raccoons on these islands. So but it's nonetheless, it's still sad to see these poor animals suffering. It's not their fault that they're there in these drier conditions, but they're there in these drier conditions. When it gets wet, then they suffer. But typically they're not really there in any large numbers. Now the deer, on the other hand, that's a little different. I think the deer, they can tolerate much deeper conditions. They're not so affected by the alligators. So and we did lose a lot of deer this year because of those high water conditions.
Mark, there's a question about the snail kite population, and if you can comment on that, the population in the refuge.
Okay, I'm not so sure about, we haven't had many snail kite nests in the Everglades. They do occasionally nest in the refuge and in 3A. Historically, that's where they used to nest in large numbers. But with drying conditions, it's, again, these birds are very sensitive. Well, actually, there's two things going on. The first thing with snail kites is the loss of apple snails, the native apple snail from the Everglades. The numbers of native apple snails has declined dramatically. Right now, we're doing a bunch of studies at the Lila facility, looking at what the habitat requirements for those native snails, and also how the non-native invasive snail is impacting those populations. And maybe next year I can give you, next year is actually the 20th anniversary of Lila. So maybe next year I could give a presentation on some of the research that we're doing there. But basically we're losing all the native apple snails, and the non-native species isn't particularly that abundant in the Everglades.
We accept your offer.
And yeah, so they don't have a very good prey resource in the Everglades anymore. The number of apple snails is much lower than it used to be. The other issue is that when they do nest, because it's typically quite dry in some areas, again, we get the raccoons moving in. And again, these birds, like the white ibis and other wading birds, very sensitive to mammalian predation when the system dries out.
A question here about measuring water depth and the method of counting nests. So technological methods.
Okay, so measuring water depths, there's a series of water level gauges throughout all of the Everglades. And what you were seeing on those maps that I showed was a modeled representation of water depth, which are published and validated and are fairly accurate. So what happens is that you have all these gauges producing water depths, and then there's a fancy computer program that creates, that also has all the known elevational depths of the Everglades, and is able to calculate the depths at a spatial scale. So that's how we're and it's called EDEN, the Everglades Depth Estimation Model. And if you Google that, you can get a lot more information about how that's used and the validation that went into that. And by the way, so I've been validating that habitat suitability model, with the green areas where the birds forage. And I can pretty much guarantee if there's a green area in a good area of foraging habitat in the Everglades, that's where the birds will be. So it works really well. And I've been very impressed with it.
And how about counting nests, Mark?
Okay, so counting nests, that happens in multiple ways. So so historically, we use helicopters or planes. I do it, Everglades National Park does it, and the University of Florida does it. And we have two methods. First of all, we do these systematic flights over the entire Everglades to find the colonies. And then when we find the colonies, then what we do is we circle at about 500 feet. We take preliminary counts from the airplane or helicopter, and we take a series of photographs as well. And then we kind of stitch those photographs together and then do counts. But now technology has improved so much, and also some of these colonies are enormous now. And you've seen what's happened over the last few years. We're now getting colony sizes in the tens of thousands. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to count tens of thousands in the helicopter. It's impossible. Right. So the University of Florida are developing this new technology using drones, where they have GPS, really high, incredibly accurate tracking of the GPS. They take photos of the entire colony. The location of each photograph is accurate to within centimeters of its GPS location. And then they've developed this algorithm that stitches all of this together on a giant supercomputer. Remember, some of these colonies, that Alley North colony, is about a mile long and a third of a mile wide. It's enormous. It's absolutely huge. So they stitch it all together, and now they're counting it all by hand, on this huge image. But by using a photograph like that, they can actually tick them off. But what they're trying to do is develop a counting algorithm where they're actually able to use a computer to count those nests. And it's going to be fantastic because we can look at nest turnover rates, fledging success, and all sorts of things. So yeah, the technology is really advancing in terms of counting these nests. But right now, there's still a lot of, it doesn't mean we're going to stop doing it from the helicopter for these smaller colonies, because there's no way we can have an army of drones flying over the Everglades.
Mark, just two more questions.
Sure.
Someone is asking about the wood stork population sort of taking over at Loxahatchee, and I suppose that could extend to a broader question about wood storks.
Okay, so what happens is, the Loxahatchee wetland is basically an outpost of the Everglades as far as these wood storks are concerned. These wood storks nesting at Loxahatchee and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Loxahatchee right, but they're nesting there, but most of those birds are actually foraging in the Everglades. It's only, you know, a short hop, skip, and a jump for these birds to fly into the refuge and the water conservation areas. So really, it's an outpost. So what happens is when we have a good nesting season in the Everglades, you typically get a lot of those wood storks nesting at Loxahatchee. And so, you know, I've heard people complaining, oh, the wood storks are taking over. Well, actually, they're not taking over. We should be really happy that this, you know, threatened species is nesting in a place where we can almost touch them. It's incredible. The great blue herons, they're doing just fine. Those numbers have actually increased dramatically in recent years. And although they're, you know, the great blue herons are nesting elsewhere in Loxahatchee, their numbers actually haven't declined. So none of the other animals or birds are actually being driven out of Loxahatchee. What we're just seeing is during good years, we're seeing a resurgence of these wood storks in Loxahatchee. And in my mind, that's a wonderful thing to see.
And lastly, Mark, there's a question about the balance between the water releases that are coming through the restoration work and the if there's a terrific year of water, as you were discussing last year, naturally, and how that balance is going to be kept and addressed.
You mean the fact that there's going to be more water flowing into the Everglades?
Yes, I think that's the question, based through the restoration project.
Yeah, right. Well, the Everglades needs more water. That, you know, the Everglades is actually, you know, some areas of the Everglades are too deep. You know, these water conservation areas, including the refuge, are basically like, you know, huge bathtubs sitting on a slope. Okay, they, you know, they're impounded. They're on a slope, so the top part of the bathtub is too shallow and the bottom part is too deep. And that's because we don't have a flowing system anymore. And so unfortunately, you know, even though there's not enough water in the Everglades, there's still areas that are too deep. And you know, that can obviously affect tree islands and the ridge and slough landscape, and it's not good for the ridge and slough landscape. Now, as far as water coming into the Everglades, more water, that's a good thing. Now, remember what's happening with the fact that simultaneous to the fact that there's more water coming into the system, there's also more water being able to flow through the system. So we now have two Tamiami large bridges that allows flows from the water conservation area 3A into Everglades National Park. There's been major improvements to the C111 canal down near the Taylor Slough region. So that enables more water to flow through that into Taylor Slough, into Florida Bay. A new development called SEP is just about to start. So we're going to have a huge reservoir to take that water. And also, we're going to do things like block up the Miami Canal to allow more flows to go into those parched areas of northern 3A. So it's not so much flooding all the southern parts, but much ultimately with all the changes that are happening, is going to be much more flow through the system, which is a good thing. We need that water. You know, we don't want it too deep. Having it too deep is not, we want lots of water. We don't want the Everglades drying out, but we want that water to be able to flow through. So right now it's kind of ponded and too deep in places, but what we're aiming for is a flowing system. So we get more water flowing through the system, going to the southern part of the Everglades and into Florida Bay, to create some of the scenes that you saw today again. So I'm not, my worry actually is not that there's going to be too much water. My worry is there still isn't going to be enough water to be able to have a flowing system.
Mark, thank you so much. There in the chat, there are numerous people commending you on an amazing presentation. We appreciate it. Just one concluding note, our next event is Thursday, January 27th at 6 p.m. with Laura Brandt, as Mark mentioned earlier. She is a scientist and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Laura will speak about alligators and crocodiles and what they can tell us about the health of the Everglades. Thank you all for attending, especially those who stuck with us for an hour and a half. And we're grateful for your support, and we'll see you at the refuge. Good night.
Thank you, guys. Maybe see you next year.
We'll look forward to it. Thanks, Mark.